All right, good morning. We're ready to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning to remember and to reflect on Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. I just want to thank our two presenters this morning, our in-house talent, Rabbi Itamar Rosenzweig, and our Yoetzet Halacha, Professor Nechama Price, who are such beloved teachers, both in our community and beyond. I just want to make a few comments of introduction before I turn it over to Rabbi Rosenzweig, who will speak first, followed by Professor Price. When I think of Rabbi Sacks, I think most of his accessibility. He was a thinker. His training is in Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy, and yet he was someone who had a remarkable talent to make Jewish ideas, sophisticated Jewish learning, accessible to everyone. He didn't remain in the ivory tower. His ideas, no matter how academic or philosophical or theoretical may have been their origin, he was someone who really grounded them in our living experience, and it did so in such articulate and clear fashion that he made himself and his ideas and his teaching so accessible. And that's why I've been thinking this past week about how much our world, our society needs Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks more than ever. At a time when people of different ideologies, excuse me, find it harder and harder to even listen to each other, let alone take each other's ideas seriously, Rabbi Sacks stood out as someone who could talk to and be listened to by people of so many different communities, beliefs, and identities. His oratory, his insight, his broad array of ideas earned him widespread admiration and esteem. And the courage he displayed as an advocate for Jewish ideas and values garnered him enormous respect. We need him more than ever. When he visited Englewood for Shabbos in 2014, I had the distinct honor of sitting next to him on the bima in the front of Shul. He asked me how I was doing as a rabbi, and he listened attentively. And then he recommended to me a book on leadership. And I was so touched that he recommended this book to me. I later learned that he recommends this book to everybody, but I'm still equally touched. The book is entitled Leadership on the Line, and it's authored by Ronald Chaffetz and Marty Linsky. And in 2015, Rabbi Sacks published a book of his own entitled Lessons in Leadership that contains essays on the weekly parsha that provide insights into leadership. And the foreword of the book was written by none other than Ronald Chaffetz, one of the co-authors of Leadership on the Line. And Chaffetz writes the following in his foreword. He writes, by analyzing the practices of leadership and structures of authority in the Bible, Rabbi Sacks shows us how the struggle we face today, every day, can be guided by the stories of our ancestors. Our struggle is neither entirely new, nor are we alone in having to discover solutions. But what a remarkable way of capturing what Rabbi Sacks was able to do. One of the central lessons that emerges from Rabbi Sacks's book is first described by Chaffetz in that foreword. And he writes very briefly, he writes how he, Ronald Chaffetz, advises leaders of all kinds, from CEOs to political leaders, that leadership should generate capacity, not dependency. In other words, effective leaders cultivate the talents and skills of the members of their group. They don't just tell them what to do. And Rabbi Sacks echoes this message in his introduction to this book, Lessons in Leadership. And in the course of echoing this message, he tells the story of how he first met the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It was the late 60s, and Rabbi Sacks comes to America, and he wants to meet the Rav and Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he tells the story of how he meets the Rebbe. It takes him a while to get in, to get a meeting. And when he finally meets the Rebbe, I'm just going to quote a little bit from the book. He was quite unlike what I expected, Rabbi Sachs writes. There was no charisma, no overflowing personality. To the contrary, he was so self-effacing that there seemed to be only one person in the room, the person to whom he was speaking. And Rabbi Sachs begins to ask him questions. And then the Rebbe starts asking him questions. How many Jewish students were there at Cambridge? How many of them were engaged in Jewish life? How many came to synagogue? And Rabbi Sachs writes that this line of questioning was not what he was expecting. I had not the slightest intention of taking on any leadership role because the Rebbe asked him, what is he doing about this? I began a torturous statement explaining why this had nothing to do with me. And yet, the Rebbe said to him, you do not find yourself in a situation, you put yourself in one. And if you put yourself in one situation, you can put yourself in another situation. And quite soon it became clear what the Rebbe was doing. He was challenging him to act. And Rabbi Sachs goes on to write, what I learned from him was that a good leader creates followers, a great leader creates leaders. And that's what Ahavath wrote about what he advises leaders, is that leaders are those who are able to cultivate others to engage in behaviors that we might call leadership, but are really just contributing to the world around them, taking an active role in engaging one's own life and the lives of those around them. And I'd like to share just one more idea from Rabbi Sachs in which he reflects on this idea further, because at the end of this book, Lessons in Leadership, in the afterword, he offers 7 principles of Jewish leadership. The 7th of those principles is that we are all summoned to the task. Rabbi Sachs observes that at Ma'amad Har Sinai, the Jewish people are given a mission statement to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a kingdom, every one of whose members is called on to be holy. And so in essence, we are called on to be a people of leaders. There may be a certain class called Kohanim, but each one of us are summoned to be a Kohen. And so this idea of leadership that Rabbi Sachs develops over the course of this particular book, among many other ideas, is the notion that great leaders develop the capacity in others for people to be independently engaged and active in their own Jewish experience and their own thinking and the development of their ideas and values. And it seems clear to me that the greatest tribute to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs would be continue his mission, to continue studying his Torah in ways that inspire us to model aspects of leadership and this lesson in leadership in our own Jewish experience. We don't have to occupy formal positions of leadership to follow this lesson that he imparted. He was a person who was able to translate his ideas and his insights into very worldly, practical wisdom. And I think if we continue to engage his writings and his legacy, I think we will perpetuate his role as a leader in Jewish thought and practice. I now turn the program over to Rabbi Rosenzweig. I'm going to spotlight his video so that he can make his presentation. All right, Rabbi Rosenzweig.
All right, I'm here.
Great.
I have the green light.
Go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Pupko. It's great to see so many familiar faces. And even though the faces I don't see, it's nice to see familiar names for all those hiding behind the Zoom blank screen. So it's really wonderful to see everyone this morning. I echo much of what Rabbi Pupko said about Rabbi Sachs, and I'm also excited to hear Professor Price's presentation on the Parshanut of Rabbi Sachs coming up. Chazal say Malin Bekodesh V'lo Moridin from this point on, not from Rabbi Pupko to me, but for the second half. I want to discuss an article that Rabbi Sachs wrote as a window into his philosophy. And I think the window will, it'll give us insight into one important aspect of where I think Rabbi Sachs's outlook is distinctive and contrasts with the more familiar models that we're acquainted with. I just want to say that growing up, I wasn't so familiar with Rabbi Sachs's writing. Growing up, I didn't read much of his books or articles, which is a strange thing for somebody growing up in the YU modern Orthodox world. I think there's a reason why that is, which I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. But over the last few months, I started to read more of Rabbi Sachs's Uver, and there's really a wealth of insightful and powerful material that he committed his life to. But the article I want to talk about today is one of his earlier pieces before he became chief rabbi of the UK. And it's not an article in which he was developing his own view. It's an article in which he's reviewing a work by the Rav. It's a review of the Rav's Halachic Mind, this book over here. And Rabbi Sachs offers both a survey, a review of the Rav's piece, how this book fits in with the Rav's other writings. And then he has some reflections on the Rav's Uver as a whole at the end, which I think will give us insight into Rabbi Sachs's own philosophy and where he differs in an important way from the Rav. So I know some of you are thinking that this is going to be an excuse to talk about the Rav's philosophy, but we're not going to do that. We're going to look at Rabbi Sachs's review as a way of teasing out an important difference between the way he sees things and the way the Rav sees things. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take 20 minutes to discuss this article by Rabbi Sachs. So here I'm going to share. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Everyone? Okay. So this is published in Tradition in 1988. You could see over here at the top of the article, Dr. Sachs's Principle of Jews College. So this is before I think he became chief rabbi. This is 1988. And again, as I mentioned, the article is a review of what he calls Rabbi Soloveitchik's early epistemology. It's a review of Halachic Mind. Halachic Mind is the least known of the Rav's works for good reason. Rabbi Pupko mentioned that most of Rabbi Sachs's stuff is super accessible. The Rav's Halachic Mind is super inaccessible. It's tortuous, really very difficult to read, to get through. Rabbi Sachs does a wonderful job trying to make it more accessible, but you'll see even here it's difficult. So bear with me on some of the more abstract parts of Rabbi Sachs's presentation. The point that I want to make, the big point that I want to make is quite accessible. So the Rabbi Sachs starts off with a bit of a survey of the Rav's writings. I'm going to point to a few lines, but in the opening section of this article, he's interested in how the Rav's Halachic Mind fits into the Rav's other writings, like Halachic Man, Lonely Man of Faith, Uvikashtem Misham. Rabbi Sachs wants to know, like, what does Halachic Mind have to do with these other writings? So he starts off here and he says, he talks about Lonely Man of Faith, for example. And he says, Lonely Man of Faith is an analysis of the perennial conflicts of the religious man, okay? So he just notes a lot of the Rav's writings focus on the tension between being a religious person and a man of the world, a member of society. For those of you who are familiar with the Rav's writings, that a lot of it's about the struggle. A lot of it's about the dialectic between the religious life and the dialectic between the world, the general world and society that we inhabit. That's how Rabbi Sachs starts off his article, and we're going to return to that theme at the very end of the presentation. The centrality of dialectic, the struggle, the tension between the religious and the non-religious in the Rav's writings. So Rabbi Sachs starts off on that note. You could see he's very excited about the Rav's commitment to philosophy. So he says, the Rav didn't publish so much in his lifetime. And look at this phrase. He says, there was an air of mystery about the submerged iceberg of an unpublished corpus. Like what was the Rav sitting on in his lifetime that wasn't published? And he says, the Rav has a footnote in Lonely Man of Faith where the Rav writes, the role of multi-valued logic in halacha will be discussed by me, God willing, in a forthcoming paper. That paper was never published, but you can see Rabbi Sachs is very excited about the prospect that the Rav is sitting on these philosophical manuscripts that were going to be published or could be published at any moment. In his description of halachic mind and what distinguishes it from other works, Rabbi Sachs writes, halachic mind is a remarkable work, different in kind from the Rav's other writings. It's a sustained exposition of epistemology and the philosophy of science. So for example, when I read halachic mind growing up, my father told me you could skip over the first 3 sections because it's just the Rav showing off how much philosophy he knows. You just skip to the last section where he talks about Judaism. So there's a sense that that's like the way to read halachic mind, skip over the philosophy. You could get to the interesting stuff at the end. You can see Rabbi Sachs is quite excited by this. He says, it's a remarkable work, different from the Rav's other writings because a lot of it is just like sustained exposition of a theory of knowledge and philosophy of science. Note this, devoid of dialectical tension, rhapsodic prose. It's not the Rav of halachic man where he uses all these evocative formulations to try to tug at the heartstrings, as Danny once told me, right? Halachic man tries to tug at the heartstrings. Not halachic mind. There's no anecdotal digression. The Rav is not telling stories about his father and grandfather, about Brisk. There's no exegetical innovation. So it's just a technical piece of philosophy. And as Rabbi Sachs says, it displays a yet more awesome command of the philosophical literature than which would astound readers from the Rav's other writings. I just want to draw attention to this point that you really see Rabbi Sachs's excitement at the Rav doing pure philosophy. I think, again, as I said, there's a tendency to say that halachic mind, the important part is at the very end, where he talks about Judaism. Rabbi Sachs here has an admiration for the Rav's prowess in pure analytical philosophy, the first half of halachic mind, which is usually seen as not the important part of the work. So I just want to flag that excitement that Rabbi Sachs here suggests about the pure philosophy part of things, and I'm going to return to that at the end of my discussion. So 2 themes I want to bring out so far in this article, just to review. The first theme is this idea of the Rav's works are typified by this tension, a conflict between the religious man and the secular world that he inhabits. And then the second theme here that Rabbi Sachs is, just pointing out how excited he is that we have this work of pure philosophy that the Rav published. Okay. In the next section, what he calls epistemological foundations, Rabbi Sachs is again trying to figure out how this work fits into the Rav's broader works. And he says, again, pointing to the tension in the Rav's writing, he talks about Lonely Man of Faith, which discusses an existentialism of divided selfhood and ceaseless conflict. This goes back to our first theme. The Rav portrays a religious person as just a man just embroiled by tension and conflict, a divided self. The man of faith, wrote Rabbi Soloveitchik, was condemned to move between the majestic and covenantal communities, just an eternally wandering Aramaean. That's how the Rav, at least in Rabbi Sachs's mind, that's how the Rav portrays the Jew, this unsettled self struggling between these different worlds. He has a nice quote from a different piece of the Rav. The Rav writes, Judaic dialectic, so Jewish tension, is irreconcilable and hence interminable. So it's like there's something irreconcilable about being a Jew in the modern world. And Rabbi Sachs points out that that's central to the Rav's early writings. On page 77 of this article, Rabbi Sachs quotes the Rav again. Oopsies, somebody else is highlighting my screen.
I'll fix that.
Yeah, you want to fix that, right, Pupko?
Yeah.
Just want to make sure we don't have a Zoom bomber.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Okay, so Rabbi Sachs writes over here, let's see, quoting the Rav, that the Rav writes about the conflicted human situation. These things are central. He's quoting an analysis of the Rav, but this conflict is central to the Rav's fight, to the Rav's thought. Okay, that's the introduction to the article there by Sachs, the way he introduces the article. And when he closes this section, he says there's a hermeneutic problem that's going to remain about how to reconcile this idea of, the Rav's, this kind of inner tension between the Rav's different writings about whether religious life is a stable life or whether religious life is a life of conflict and unsettledness. Okay, that's the background here. Then he moves in to the next section of his piece on page 78, where he gets into the heart of the Rav's argument in halachic mind. And he says, the central argument of halachic mind is that religion constitutes an autonomous cognitive domain. I know that sounds very abstract for all of us, but what he's characterizing in the Rav's argument of halachic mind is, to make a long story short, the Rav thinks that for many years, religion was subjected to the scrutiny of how it coheres with contemporary science, how it coheres with contemporary psychology, with contemporary physics. And you could imagine like the old conflicts, like does the Torah's account of science, of the creation, cohere with the way scientists think of it? Things like that. And the Rav says that for many centuries, it was very difficult to defend Judaism from the criticism of scientists and like the scientific way of looking at the world. That's how the Rav opens halachic mind. Historically, the Rav says Judaism was threatened by the advances of science and scientific knowledge, which delegitimized some of the claims that halakha seems to make, that Jewish thought seems to make. And what the Rav tries to do in halachic mind, as Rabbi Sachs tells us over here, is the Rav wants to say that there were developments in 19th century and 20th century thought that create a space for autonomous religious thought, in which our philosophizing about religion and Judaism will no longer be subjected to the scrutiny of science and psychology and other fields of human knowledge. This is the main idea of halachic mind. So the Rav here says, and Rabbi Sachs tells us, the starting point of the book is that the 20th century has opened up a gap between science and philosophy, and in the void thus created, there is room for the first time for a fully autonomous religious thought. I'll explain this a little more precisely. What the Rav is thinking of here is that for many centuries, scientists thought that there's only one way to think of something like space. There's only one way to think of something like time, and the way scientists describe it is the right way, and any other conception of space and time or whatever has to yield to the way scientists describe it. That's how the Rav describes the history of thinking about religion. But the Rav thinks that the advances of 20th century physics show that space and time and the way scientists think of it is so radically different from the way ordinary people encounter it, that there was this wedge that was created between the way science views the world and the way humans actually experience the world. And so there's this notion that they're just two different domains. There's the domain of scientists, how they characterize things, and then there's the domain of actual experience. And the Rav thinks, this is the argument of halachic mind, that once we appreciate that science operates at a different level from the way we subjectively experience reality, there's room for religious thought not to be subjected anymore to the scrutiny of science. That's the main argument of halachic mind. So I'll give you an example here from Rabbi Sachs's summary of it. The Rav, he says the Rav's conclusion is that there's an emergence of epistemological pluralism, different ways of looking at the world. There's the scientific way of looking at the world, and then there's a religious way of looking at the world. And these operate in different domains, so neither conflicts or is subject to the scrutiny of the other. I think a lot of us have been trained to think in this way because a lot of us, grow up in this YU Soloveitchian way of thinking about things. Right? There's the domain of religion, there's the domain of science, and they're trying to do different things. So Rabbi Sachs gives us a nice example. He says the pluralism arises from the fact that concepts in the new sciences neither mirror ordinary experience nor remain constant between disciplines. So the idea is that space might mean one thing to the mathematician, something else to the physicist, and a third an ordinary experience. So there's this breakdown. There are different domains. So like, what is space? If you're looking at it through the lens of philosophy, it's going to mean one thing. Through the lens of science, it'll mean something else. Through the lens of mathematics, something else. Through the lens of halacha and Judaism, something else. And all of those are just different valid perspectives on what space is. That's the Rav's claim in halachic mind. And so the Rav says, therein, Rabbi Sachs explains, therein lies the great liberation. Because so long as Judaism was harnessed to the scientific way of looking at the world, there could be no way for there to be this legitimate Jewish way of looking at the world that's distinct. And he says, now there opens up an alternative to the scientific description of reality. This is where religious experience belongs, in the concrete world full of color and sound. Okay, that's what the Rav's main argument is, and the Rav thinks that the halacha, the system of Jewish thought, gives us a whole new way, a whole separate way of conceiving of the world, and this is very much the Rav's project. Rabbi Sachs here quotes. On the bottom of page 80 of this article, the Rav writes over here, the canonized scripture, the Rav thinks, is the place we start to articulate our Jewish worldview. Objectification, meaning an objective Jewish way of looking at the world, reaches its highest expression in the halacha. It's like you just study the halacha, and the halacha is going to give us this autonomous Jewish way of looking at the world. This is, very much the Rav's philosophy. Now, notice this line. The Rabbi Sachs here on page 81, make sure I'm on the right, on page 81, says, the halachic mind ends by disassociating itself from medieval Jewish philosophy. So the Rav's saying, all this analysis leads me to criticize like what the Rambam did in his philosophizing. And the Rav gives two reasons. He gives a few reasons. One reason is that medieval Jewish philosophy was rooted in non-indigenous sources, ancient Greek and medieval Arabic. So the Rav's whole point is that we have to think of Judaism and Jewish thought internally, whereas people like the Rambam thought about it through the categories of medieval Greek philosophy. And the Rav's criticizing that because that doesn't respect the autonomy, the independence of halacha to view it through the lens of Greek philosophy. This is a very important point that Rabbi Sachs is emphasizing here. So I want to draw specific attention to this comment. And the Rav says, an autonomous Jewish philosophy is possible and can only be constructed on the basis of halacha. This is, very Soloveitchian. Okay. Now, that's Rabbi Sachs's summary. what I want to focus on now is Rabbi Sachs's assessment of the Rav's contribution in this work. And here I want to emphasize a few points. If you look on page 82 of this article, Rabbi Sachs, I think here, is criticizing the Rav's approach. So he says, in just his general reflections, his third general reflection, is there's a surprising but unmistakable echo of Rav Hirsch in the book's closing pages, where the Rav criticizes the Rambam. There's the same attack on Maimonides and others. So like Rav Hirsch criticized Moses Mendelssohn, Rav's criticizing others for interpreting Judaism through non-Jewish concepts. So the Rav thought you have to call to know Judaism out of itself. There's this problem with trying to understand Judaism through the concepts of Greek philosophy or through the concepts of 19th century philosophy. Everything has to be internal. It has to be self-understood through its own lenses. And what Rabbi Sachs is pointing out is that the Rav here is a partner in arms with Rav Hirsch in this kind of skepticism, looking askance and critically upon those who try to interpret the meaningfulness of certain aspects of Judaism through non-Jewish concepts. The Rav thought that everything has got to be extracted just out of the interpretation of halacha. And then in this paragraph, and you can see, I think Rabbi Sachs is skeptical of the Rav's method here. In the next paragraph, he says, indeed, even the weaknesses of the halachic mind, which is a not so thinly veiled criticism of the halachic mind. He says the weaknesses of the halachic mind mirror those of Hirsch. And that is the same equivocation between a penetrating methodological critique of reform and a quite disparate ethical denunciation. What he points out is that both the Rav and Rav Hirsch take as their enemies to be Reform Judaism, this kind of criticism of people who aren't as committed to a halachic way of life. And they criticize people who are just like universal humanists. There's some ethic that's not objectively grounded. So Rabbi Sachs here thinks that he calls this the weakness of the halachic mind. And I think this is, very much a part of Rabbi Sachs's own thought. You don't see him criticizing other denominations of Judaism. He doesn't criticize universal humanism. He sees those two aspects of halachic mind and Rav Hirsch's thought as weaknesses that both would equivocate, both of them would view this kind of similarity between the Reform and this universal humanism. He says both the Rav and Rav Hirsch see humanism as prone to corruption and religious liberalism as arbitrary, etc., etc. What both the Rav and Rav Hirsch want is to create space for Judaism to be itself. And in this paragraph, you get the sense that Rabbi Sachs, even in his earliest writings here, is a little skeptical of that enterprise. Even here, in the next section, in the next comment that he generally wants to take away from the Rav's writing, he says there's something dated about the Rav's philosophical analysis. He says inevitably the book has a somewhat dated feel about it. He says for those of us raised in the modern philosophy world, if you read Wittgenstein, or even Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, he says that puts under pressure a lot of the Rav's, like the framework that the Rav is using philosophically. Rabbi Sachs wonders if the Rav's philosophy has to be updated in order to make whether the Rav's argument would still hold in light of some recent breakthroughs in philosophy. So I just want to emphasize that point because Rabbi Sachs here is doing real work in questioning whether the Rav's philosophical framework is as sound as halachic mind makes it out to be. He says, philosophy's changed a lot since the Rav's days, and even the conception of science has changed since the publication of this work by Kuhn. I won't bore us all with the boring details of Kuhn and Wittgenstein. But notice that Rabbi Sachs is subjecting the Rav's philosophy to scrutiny. He wants to know whether it's up to date in the right way. Now, the last point, and this I think is the most powerful part of the piece, and which I think brings together some of the themes that we saw in the opening pages of the piece. So again, look at this paragraph. Rabbi Sachs celebrates the Rav's work of pure philosophy. It's not something you see from first-class Talmidei Chachamim engaging just philosophy in this pure way. The Halachic Mind is a deeply impressive work, furnishing new evidence of Rabbi Soloveitchik's unrivaled mastery of secular sources and disclosing a tone of voice we had not heard before. The Dr. Soloveitchik of Berlin, rather than the Rav of Yeshiva University. I think few people could write a line like this with the enthusiasm that Rabbi Sachs writes it. You know, for a lot of people, it's the Rav of Yeshiva University that excites people about the Rav's thought. And here you see Rabbi Sachs being excited by seeing the side of the Dr. Soloveitchik of Berlin rather than the Rav of Yeshiva University. So I think that's insightful, and it's consistent with the opening pages where Rabbi Sachs says, this is an exciting work. It's different from the Rav's other works. It's not stories about brisk. It's not rhapsodic tugging at the heartstrings in the Foyer sense. It's just a work of pure intellectual philosophy, or at least the first part of it, the part that I said most of us are told to skip over. But Rabbi Sachs is excited by that prospect. But here is another theme that I think is important to emphasize. In summarizing, and I'm going to wrap up in the next 3 minutes. In summarizing the Rav's thought in this, or the relation, or the main conclusion of Halachic Mind, Rabbi Sachs writes, the very force of the arguments suggests that reality can be sliced up and interpreted in infinitely many ways. Like the core argument of Halachic Mind is that there are just different ways of seeing the world. There's the physics, the way of the physicists. There's the way of the mathematician. And then there's the way of religion. There's the way of the halacha. And these are just different ways. There's a pluralism. There are different ways of approaching the world, and they're valid in their different domains. And Rabbi Sachs is uncomfortable with this. He's uncomfortable with the pluralism that the Rav's philosophy allows for. He says, if reality corresponds to each of them, is it significant to say that it corresponds to any? He's just like wondering, like, which is the world really like then, right? The religious way of seeing it or the scientific way of seeing it. And so he's wondering whether the Rav's pluralism is the right way to go. And look what he says in the next section, in the next paragraph, in the next page. This is page 84. He says, here, the Rav's pluralism, so summarizing this part of it, would not justify the conclusion he wants to reach, namely that some forms of religion, I was going to say, are more legitimate than others, Halachic Judaism most of all. Rabbi Sachs here is saying once you allow for this kind of pluralism, he doesn't see how the Rav could defend that there's something uniquely special about the halachic way of seeing things. I'm not endorsing the Rabbi Sachs's criticism of the Rav here. My parents would disentitle me to inheritance if I were to endorse it. But Rabbi Sachs here is basically wondering whether there's the pluralism of the Rav leaves us with a way of saying that there's something special about the way the halacha sees things. Look here. This relates to another ambivalence, here as elsewhere in Rav Soloveitchik's work, between the universal and the particular. He thinks the Rav hasn't fully figured out the relationship between Judaism and the world. Remember, in the beginning of the essay, he tells us about how the Rav's works are all about the fundamental tension, the dialectic between the religious life and the worldly life. And he says, is halachic mind about religion or about Judaism? Is the religious person portrayed in its pages a religious man or the Jew? So Rabbi Sachs wants to know, like, to what extent is the Rav's comments, the Rav's analysis here, universal to religion or distinct to a Jewish way of viewing the world? And he says, the Rav has a predisposition to welcome halachic Judaism. But Rabbi Sachs thinks he's not sure if the arguments that the Rav gives in halachic mind say something special about halacha per se or about religion writ large. And he says the Rav just says that Judaism has this very special way of the world, of viewing the world, that's autonomous, but shouldn't it equally follow that all there are other religious views that are not subject to the scrutiny of science and exist in their own autonomous domains. Here he says the Rav has provided an argument for the autonomy of religions in the plural. Meaning Rabbi Sachs here is just not sure about the way the Rav is portraying the halacha as a special system, rather than religion in a general sense as having this autonomous place to thrive. And again, you could see here, he thinks there's a straight road from the halachic mind to what the Rav says in confrontation, that there's no ultimate dialogue between religions, is what the Rav says, because the Rav thinks that each religion is totally incomprehensible to the man of a different faith community. And you can see Rabbi Sachs is bristling at that idea of the Rav. He's uncomfortable with the notion that there's this fundamental incompatibility between religions. The Rav thinks, like, if you're a halachic man, you can't even talk in the same language to a Christian priest. And Rabbi Sachs says, yeah, the Rav has this similar commitment in both works, but you get the sense that he's bristling at this way of seeing things. And now I'm gonna wrap up here. So the Rav says, Rabbi Sachs writes here. These are all symptoms of the dual direction of Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought, projecting the autonomy and cognitive integrity of the halachic system on the one hand, arguing its supremacy over other systems on the other. The former embraces pluralism, but the latter rejects it. And so you see Rabbi Sachs likes the pluralistic side. He doesn't like the supremacy of the halachic side in his analysis of the Rav. Okay, now to wrap up here, Rabbi Sachs summarizes. He says, the transition, and this is the most poignant part of the article, the transition from 19th century liberalism to 20th century pluralism promises much to religious orthodoxy. Instead of having to justify itself at the bar of an enlightened world, Judaism and religion could declare independence without forfeiting rationality. We have our autonomous domain of religious thought. But Rabbi Sachs thinks there's a tremendous cost that this comes at. This kind of way of saying science, philosophy has one way of looking at the world. We as Jews have a different way of looking at the world. So Rabbi Sachs writes over here. So the Rav paints it all as liberation. We're liberated from the harness of having to answer to science. But the pluralism of knowledge was mirrored in society as well. And this is Rabbi Sachs thinks there's a real cost that the Rav's philosophy comes at. He says, the single universe of pre-modernity, the universe inhabited by Maimonides, in which the God of Abraham and of Aristotle were indeed one, the universe in which science and philosophy and religion all competed in a single arena, the universe whose last Jewish inhabitant was Rav Kook, was shattered. So you could see here, Rabbi Sachs is saying, there's something nice about living in a single world where our Judaism is our science and our science is our philosophy and our Judaism is our philosophy. The Rav sets it up in that these realms are just so disparate. And Rav Sachs says, that's shattering the world of the Rambam, right? We're no longer in the world where we even think that the God of Abraham is the same God of Aristotle, right? We've just come to compartmentalize the way we see things. And Rabbi Sachs says that comes to this plurality of thought worlds and also a plurality of identities. And he says, that's why contemporary man has this dichotomy of public and private spheres. We're schizophrenic. There's a certain homelessness that we feel where our religious world is not our general world, and our general world is not our religious world, and our scientific world is not our halachic world. Rabbi Sachs thinks this is the cost of the Rav's way of thinking about things. And he says, so beautifully and insightfully, he says, well, which world is this? That's the world of the lonely man of faith. He says, that's why the Rav's Uver has the schizophrenic man, the man who can't reconcile his religion with being a man of the world. So Rabbi Sachs comes full circle here to say, that's why there's something about halachic mind, about setting up the autonomy of religion, that explains why the Rav's lonely man of faith is so dialectical. You can't reconcile the tension between these different pluralistic worlds that he inhabits. And I think when you read Rabbi Sachs's reflection on this, he says this poignantly. I think he thinks it's a real concern. And he says, the Rav tells us that Judaism is timeless and autonomous, but how much of it can be expressed in the language of the world depends on where the world is at a given moment. And he says, the Rav liberated tradition from having to vindicate itself, but the pluralism also gives rise to a kind of privation, where we're forced to kind of live schizophrenically between these two worlds. And he closes his comment here. Rabbi Soloveitchik's genius and the poignancy of his intellectual development are both evidenced here. He was the first to explore the positive possibilities of liberation, but also the first to chart the tragic dimension of the privation, the tragedy that he thinks comes along with this way of viewing the world. Now, I said that growing up, I didn't read so much of Rabbi Sachs's thought. I think part of that is because exactly this criticism of the Rav's way of viewing the world. There's really a disagreement here about how to reconcile the world of universal knowledge with the world of Torah knowledge. For the Rav, there's very much a tension. These come at the expense of each other. I'm going to close here. I just want to quote Rabbi Sachs's two comments from Rabbi Sachs, both of which speak to both of these are recent. One's from 1997, one's from 2009, but both of them hammer home the theme that he articulates in 1988 in his criticism of the Rav's philosophy. He says, and you can see there's this unself-conscious, unapologetic embrace of Torah and Chachmas inhabiting a single universe, not the tension that he sees implicit in the Rav's thought. So in his book, Future Tense in 2009, he writes, Chachma is the truth we discover, Torah is the truth we inherit, Torah is the specific heritage of Israel, Chachma is what we attain by being in the image of God, Torah is what guides Jews as the people of God, Chachma is acquired by seeing and reasoning, Torah is received by listening and responding. Chachma tells us what is, Torah tells us what ought to be. Gone here is the dialectic of the Rav's thought, just a full thought throttled embrace of the complementarity of Torah v'chachma. Let me mention just one other quote from 1997 that Rabbi Sachs gave when he got an honorary doctorate from Yeshiva University. We find ourselves today in a world of two kinds of Jews. One formidably well-educated and yet Jewishly almost illiterate. Another group of Jews who are fluent in Marsha and Ktos, and yet who stammer when it comes to the cultures of the world. Hayitachin? Is that how it was supposed to be? There are cerebral lesions in which the connection can be fractured between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. I think he mentioned this when he came to Inglewood a few years back. The result is a disintegration of the personality. I believe today the Jewish people is suffering from a lesion which has broken the connection between the left and right hemispheres of the Jewish people. And there is only one group of people who can help heal the fracture. He's talking to the graduates of YU. Because alone in today's Jewish world, you have learned to combine Torah and Chachma. You know that they are not shtei reshuyos, two separate domains. They are the two hemispheres of the Jewish soul. Chachma reminds us that we are humans. We are citizens of the universal enterprise of mankind. Torah reminds us that we're Jews, heirs of the greatest heritage ever conferred upon a people. Now, there's a certain poignancy in this talk, speaking to the graduates of Yeshiva University, that they should know that these are not shtei reshuyos, these are not two different domains. But as Rabbi Sachs himself pointed out in 1988, he himself conceives of these as the two hemispheres of the Jewish soul, Torah v'chachma. These are not shtei reshuyos. And I think that's an important area where his thought and his philosophy and his embrace of Torah v'chachma actually diverges from what the Rav articulates in Halachic Mind, and possibly here too, the students of Yeshiva University. All right, Popko, you're muted.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosenzweig. We now turn things over to Nechama. All right, you're spotlighted. Go on.
Spotlighted. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Happy Thanksgiving. I am humbled and honored to be speaking to you today to teach you some of the Torah of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. I sadly have never met him personally, but I have read many of his books. When I came across Rabbi Sachs' book that Rabbi Popko mentioned, Lessons in Leadership, I could not put this book down. It related to so many ways that I love to learn Tanakh, and therefore I continue to just read every book that I could find. I read this book, fantastic, Not in God's Name, and then of course the series based on what he's written in the paper, Covenant and Conversation. And based on reading all of these books, I would like to present to you today some of his theories in terms of learning Tanakh. I discovered that Rabbi Sachs uses a literary style in analyzing the stories of Tanakh. He focuses on personalities and actions of every character in the Torah. And from each story, he doesn't just learn the story for what the story is telling, but rather he draws inspirational messages and morals from every single story. He normally draws themes throughout his book and he traces them throughout the different stories. And I'd like to pick three to discuss with you this morning. For those of you who've heard me give Tanakh Shirim before, I've been very fortunate to give many Shirim in your community. You should know that as I read his books, I was like, oh my goodness, so much of what I teach is right here. He came up with it first, right here in the books. I've been adding quotes from him throughout all of my Shirim, and he says things so beautifully and so elegantly. So this morning, as I said, I'm honored to share with you, and I will do it fairly quickly, hopefully 20 minutes tops. I'm honored to share with you three consistent themes that I have found in so many of his books relating to the characters of Torah. The first theme is what he describes and is really a massive theme that he likes to present of the call to responsibility. Rabbi Sachs believes so strongly that leadership is not about titles or positions, but rather it is about simply standing up and taking responsibility. As Rabbi Sachs said, he believed all of us can be leaders. How is that possible? He said, we can't all get titles, we can't all get positions, but if leadership is about stepping up and being responsible, that's something we can all do. And he writes that every human has to take responsibility. What does that mean? Not just take responsibility for my own actions, but take responsibilities for people around me. And he traces this theme throughout so many of the different stories in the Torah, starting from the very beginning when he discusses Adam Harishon. He says the big mistake of Adam Harishon was the fact that he denied his sin. Instead, he points his finger at Chava and he says, it's her fault, it's not my fault. He denies responsibility. Rabbi Sachs claims that this is Adam failing to take personal responsibility for his actions, blaming others instead of admitting fault. The second character to deny responsibility in his thesis is Cain, Adam's son. And his sin is similar but slightly different, because here he denies accountability for what he has done for killing his brother. When God asks him, where's your brother? He replies, Lo yadati, hashomer chi anochi. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? He calls this the refusal to accept moral responsibilities, not just personal responsibility, but moral responsibility for doing something that is so incredibly wrong, like murder. He then goes on to discuss Noah, who has the third opportunity to stand up and take responsibility for the sins of his generation. And Noah, as we know, is described as Ish Sadiq, Tamim Haya B'Dorotav. He's exceptionally righteous compared to the rest of the people in his generation. So clearly he had potential. He could be the first guy to step up and take responsibility. But says Rabbi Sachs, he failed again because he failed to invite anyone into the teva. He failed to convince anyone to repent for their actions. And he never argues with God on behalf of humanity. Don't destroy the world, Hashem, and let me give you reasons why. Nothing is stated by Noah. He fails to take collective responsibility. He was righteous, but he influenced no one. So he ends up dying drunk and dishonored. Rabbi Sachs notes that it all changes finally when we get to Avraham. Avram is the first person to really stand up and take responsibility. First, he takes personal responsibility, leaving his family behind to listen to the words of God. Second, he takes moral responsibility, rescuing Lot in the war of 4 and 5 kings. You see, he's the exact opposite of Cain. Avram sees himself as his brother's keeper. He goes to save his nephew, who he calls his brother. Ki anashim achim anachnu. We're brothers, so of course I'm going to come help you. And third, Avram takes on collective responsibility. Avram begs Hashem to save the people of Sodom. He negotiates on their behalf. Are there 50 righteous men? Are there 40? He goes all the way down to 10. Avram cares about those who are around him. He invites strangers into his home and he treats them like family. He gets involved in the lives of others. Rabbi Sachs so beautifully writes about Abraham. Avram was not a conventional leader. He did not rule a nation. There was yet a nation for him to lead. But he was the role model of leadership as Judaism understands it. Why? Simply because he took responsibility. He acted. He did not wait for others to act. To Avram, God himself says, Hitalech lefanai vehe tamim. Walk before me, meaning be a leader. Walk ahead. Take personal responsibility. Take moral responsibility. Take collective responsibility. Judaism is God's call to responsibility. The same idea is found in Rabbi Sachs' books describing Moshe Rabbeinu. One might ask, and Rabbi Sachs does, what makes Moshe worthy to be chosen as the leader of the Jewish people? What trait did he possess? And Rabbi Sachs answers, it's simple. Like Abraham, Moshe took responsibility. All of his early stories demonstrate this one point. When we first meet Moshe, he leaves the palace to witness a Mitzri hitting an older Jew. And the pasuk writes, Vayifen kol v'kol vayar ki ein ish. Unlike classic mafarshim, who translate this line as, he looked to see if no one else was watching, or he looked to see if in the future anyone worthy would come from this Egyptian. Rabbi Sachs interprets this verse differently. He writes, of course there were people around. We know Paro finds out about Moshe's actions right away. So it must be people were watching. What does this verse mean? Moshe looked this way and that way and saw that no one else was willing to intervene. He saw that no one else was going to stand up to help this older Jew. So Moshe stood up. We see this personality trait in Moshe again and again when he rebukes the Jewish man that he's about to hit his friend, and he warns him, please don't hit your friend. And again in the next story when he saves Yitro's daughters from the shepherds. Moshe could have minded his own business, but he gets involved. He takes responsibility. And this is what makes Moshe a great leader. Throughout his writings, Rabbi Sachs inspires us to take responsibility. He explains the major difference between David HaMelech and Shaul HaMelech. He asks, why does Shaul lose his kingdom and not David? Don't they both sin? And he answers, it's because of this trait of accepting responsibility. Shaul immediately denies sinning and blames the people for his action, but David immediately responds and says, Chatasi Hashem, I have sinned to Hashem, and he accepts full responsibility. This leads us to our second theme that is found over and over again in the writings of Rabbi Sacks on Tanakh characters, which I was so excited to see, which is the theme of making mistakes. Often we are instructed to look at our avot and our imahot and our leaders like Moshe and David as perfect human beings, but it is really hard for us to relate to perfection. Rabbi Sacks views all Tanakh characters through a lens of humanity, with flaws, with weaknesses, and the ability to do things that are wrong. He writes powerfully, leaders make mistakes. That is an occupational hazard of the role. But leaders are also human, and they make mistakes that have nothing to do with leadership and everything to do with human weakness and temptation. What marks a leader is not necessarily perfect righteousness. It is the ability to admit mistakes, to learn from them, and to grow from them. Of course, in his books, he highlights the sins of Yehuda and David and Shlomo when it comes to women. Also, he spends a lot of time on Sarah and her action towards Hagar. But I wanted to highlight a story where I thought his view was extremely unique, and it has to do with the Parshiot that we're reading this month. In Parshas Toldos, we read the story of Rivka convincing Yaakov to dress up like Esav and steal the bracha from his father. Rabbi Sacks's interpretation of the story is very critical of the actions of Rivka as well as the actions of Yaakov. He writes that Rivka made a big mistake, and her big mistake was a lack of communication with her husband. She's given a prophecy when the twins are born, or even before they're born, when they're in her stomach. V'Rav Yavod Tza'ir, the younger will rule the older. But then she never shares that with her husband. She keeps it a secret. Perhaps had she just told Yitzhak the truth, Yaakov is going to rule over Esav, she wouldn't have had to trick him. He would have known Yaakov is the chosen son. I should give Yaakov the bracha. But as a result of hiding this truth from her husband, Rivka is severely punished. Her favorite son is forced to run away and live with her brother, and Rivka never sees Yaakov again. Similarly, Rabbi Sacks is very critical of the actions of Yaakov in the story. Rabbi Sacks writes so interestingly how Yaakov spends most of his life wishing he was Esav. He's born holding onto Esav's ankle. He wants Esav's Bechorah status. He dresses up like Esav. And when he says those words, Anochi, Esav Bechorecha, I am Esav, your oldest son, it is because that is truly who he wished he was. Therefore, Yaakov, in his lifetime, has to go through a transformation. He must learn. He has to struggle with his own identity. According to Rabbi Sacks, when he fights with that mysterious man before he meets up with Esav, it's actually a story of Yaakov fighting with himself, fighting to figure out his own identity and who he's meant to be. Is he Esav or is he Yaakov? When the fight ends, Yaakov emerges with a brand new identity. He no longer wants to be Esav, but at the same time, he's no longer Yaakov, because that name symbolizes trickery and the boy who really always wanted to be Esav holding on to his heel. Rather, now he has transformed to a new self, and he has a new name, and that is, of course, Yisrael. Rabbi Sacks actually blames Rivka and Yaakov for stealing the bracha. He believes they never should have doubted Yitzchak's judgment in the first place. It's a crazy theory. He writes that Yitzchak knew both his sons and knew both their strengths and their weaknesses. He therefore picked out the perfect blessing for each son. Esav was supposed to be blessed with wealth and power. That was the correct bracha for Esav. Yaakov was to be blessed with the chosen land and the chosen people. That was a blessing that Yitzchak had saved for him and gives it to him later before he goes to the house of Lavan. So according to Rabbi Sacks, when Yaakov stole Esav's bracha, he stole a bracha that wasn't intended for him. He did something very wrong. And therefore, says Rabbi Sacks, when he finally returns and meets up with Esav in Parshas Vayishlach, he actually gives the bracha back. He sends his brothers gifts and cattle because it's representing the wealth, the bracha of wealth that he stole from Esav. And then he says the words, Kach na et berchati. Take back the blessing, he translates it. Take back the blessing that I stole, that is not mine, but actually belongs to you. Yaakov messed up by stealing the bracha, and then he gives it back. Rabbi Sacks does not hide from exposing the sins of our forefathers because he believes we need to know what they did wrong so that we can learn from their stories. We need to see their transformations. We need to see their growth. That's the only way we're going to learn. At the same time, this leads to the third theme, which is a bit of a controversial theme, but one that I love very much. And as many of you know, I've been giving you shiurim on these topics, which is the topic of the villains of the Torah. Rabbi Sachs sees complexity in every character in every story. And he does not simply view the characters like Ishmael or Esav as evil. He doesn't. He actually writes, the choice of Yaakov does not mean the rejection of Esav. Esav is not chosen, but neither is he rejected. He too will have his blessing, his heritage, his land. He too will have children who will become kings, who will rule and not be ruled. It's true. When we were passing by the land of Esav, God says, you can't attack him. I gave him land and he gets to keep it. But so too, he writes about Yishmael. Yitzchak had been chosen for a specific destiny, but Yishmael has not been rejected, at least not by God. He writes that there are two stories in Breshit that pull at the heartstring, there's that word again, that makes us want to cry for the characters who are in pain. And fascinatingly, what are these two stories that he highlights as emotional stories? Story of Ishmael and the story of Esau. First, he says we feel so strongly the suffering of Hagar and Ishmael when they're kicked out of the home of Abraham and they are slowly starving to death in the desert. We feel for them. And then we feel that emotional cry of Esav and Yitzchak when they discover that Yaakov stole Esav's bracha. These two stories are written in a way that makes us feel bad for Yishmael and Esav. You would have expected, he writes, the opposite. We should be happy for Yitzchak, who now gets to live alone with Abraham and doesn't have the influence of Yishmael. And we should be elated for Yaakov, who successfully stole his brother's bracha, which he's been trying to do. But the opposite is true. We feel for Yishmael and we feel for Esav. Rabbi Sachs describes the moment Yitzchak realizes that he's given the bracha to the wrong son. Listen to his words. He writes, the scene of the two together, robbed of what should have been the moment of tenderness and intimacy, son feeding father, father blessing son, is deeply affecting. There is only one other scene like it in the Torah, Hagar and Yishmael, alone in the heat of the desert without water, about to die. The comparison is deliberate. Just as there, so here, our sympathies are being enlisted on behalf of the elder son. Rabbi Sachs believes that we are meant to realize that Yishmael could not be so evil. He was loved by his father. And when Sarah tells Avram to send Yishmael away, you know what the pasuk writes? Vayera hadavar ma'od be'enei Avraham al adot beno. Avram was extremely upset about having to send his beloved son away. Rabbi Sachs uses the midrashic approach to give the story actually a very happy ending. He writes that Yishmael returns to his father and makes peace with both Avram and Yitzchak. And together, Yitzchak and Yishmael, as friends, come to bury their father. And he writes, the story beneath the story is that neither Avram nor Yitzchak made peace with the banishment of the handmaiden child. As long as Sarah was alive, they could do nothing about it, respecting her feelings as God had commanded Avram to do. But once Sarah was no longer alive, they could engage in an act of reconciliation. That is how Yitzchak and Yishmael came to be together when Avram died. So too in the story of Esav, he writes that Esav is the hero of 100 myths and legends. He is not without dignity, nor does he lack human feelings. His love for his father is genuine, as is Yitzchak's love for him. Rabbinic midrash, for educational reasons, turns Esav into a bad man. But that is not, Rabbi Sachs writes, how he is portrayed in the Bible. Instead, Rabbi Sachs describes Esav as strong, full of energy, a skilled hunter, a man of the field. And most importantly, he writes, he was the child his father loved. Esav was a force of nature. And he writes so beautifully, sibling rivalry is defeated the moment we discover that we are loved by God. For what we are, not for what someone else is. We each have our own blessing. Brothers need not conflict. Rabbi Sachs's message to us is very simple. God loves all of us. He loves all nations. He loves all people. No one is rejected by God, not even Esav or Yishmael. He believes that the goal of Sefer Bereshit is to teach us the following lessons. There was no need for fighting. There was no need for sibling rivalries and jealousy. There was no need for murdering, selling brothers, or stealing brachot. He writes so beautifully. The Torah's unmistakable message is that sibling rivalry may be natural, but it is not inevitable. It can be conquered by generosity of spirit, active efforts of reconciliation, and the realization that mimetic desire is misconceived. There is no need to want someone else's blessing because, he says, we each have our own. There is so much to say about Rabbi Sacks and the messages he taught us through his teaching of Torah and his analysis of the characters found in Tanakh. Messages of accepting responsibility for our actions and those around us, the power of growth and learning from mistakes, understanding the complexity of human beings and relationships, and God's never-ending love for each of us. Reading Rabbi Sacks's books has been inspirational to me, and I truly do hope that today's event encourages each of you to listen to his shiurim, to read his books, and to keep his Torah alive. I thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much, Professor Price and Rabbi Rosenzweig, for really enlightening us into two very different aspects of the thought and the leadership of Rabbi Sacks. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.